Welcome. My name is Andrew Stevens. I'm a consultant here with IVAS, and today we are going to be discussing purchase requisitions and workflows in AX 2012. We're just going to look at primarily how to set up the requisitions and how to set up the workflows for use in AX 2012. First thing that we'll look at is just general requisitions, where they are created, what's involved in the process. Do that by going into the procurement and sourcing module. And I'll switch over to the application so we can make that switch. We'll go into procurement sourcing. And then under common, we have the drop down for purchase requisitions. Two forms here, or two pages that you'll primarily use. First is all purchase requisitions. This is where you will create any new requisitions as well as look up any information on previously created requisitions. So very straightforward process in creating a new requisition. You're just going to click the Create New button, give this requisition a name. Click OK. Once this requisition is created, you will then have to add items to it, but first you must give it a reason. So we'll just give it a general reason for this requisition and then add an item to it. Now the requester is the person who is requesting these items. The preparer would obviously be whoever you are logged in as. You can change the requester if the permissions are set up for you to request items for another user. We're just going to leave this requester as my user, which is Julia under Burke. We're going to add an item. We use item 1000 for this example. I'm going to enter a quantity of 11. Okay, so for this requisition, we now have a quantity of 11 at $100 unit price, which makes this purchase requisition a total of $1,100. Okay. So the next thing, or the other area of purchase requisitions that you'll use regularly is once a purchase requisition is created and submitted to workflow, and that workflow process is completed and the requisition has been approved, you'll use this form to release approved purchase requisitions. What this form is going to let you do is take any requisition that has been approved in the workflow, and it's going to allow you to actually create the purchase order for any of the approved requisitions. All you would do is select the requisition for requisition to approve and click New Purchase Order. Okay. The next thing that we're going to look at, and is one of the first things that you need to make sure is set up so that you can use requisitions, is set up the hierarchy. All right, with NAX, the way the hierarchy is structured is all in the Human Resources module. You have to have three things. You have to have an employee, you have to have positions created, and you need jobs created. The way that hierarchy is structured is essentially you're going to create a job, which a job could have multiple people performing that same job. So job A, for example, could have two different positions, both performing that same job. We'll call those positions 1 and 2. A position is going to be created and expected to be filled by an employee. So when you create the position, you can also assign an employee to that position. That's kind of the general setup that must be done through the Human Resources module, which we'll take a look at. Now, one thing to make sure of, just want to point this out to make sure you're aware of it, is in the system administration, you want to make sure that any employees you set up in the hierarchy also have a user relation set up. So if you set up regulations, and it's going to allow you to submit tasks or submit approvals to them in the workflow. If they are not set up, you will get errors in your workflow, and it won't be able to make sure that every user you're going to use in the hierarchy has a user ID relation. Moving on to the Human Resources module. Like I said before, the first thing that you'll have is you'll need to create all of your jobs. This is a page where you would create any jobs that exist within your company. So for each of these jobs, you would then need to create a position. So the position is anyone who can fill that job, or a position that's expected to fill that job. So here, for example, is the position that my user is filling. When you create this position, you're going to want to assign a worker to that position. When you assign a worker to that position, you're assigning the employee, which is tied to their user ID. So this is how a person is going to get their notification. One thing, very important thing to point out here, when you're using the hierarchy structure and workflows, this reports to position from any position. This will determine the structure of your hierarchy. So this field reports to position is going to determine which or what person my user would report to in the hierarchy. So if I say in a workflow that an approval on one of my requisitions should be done by the person directly above me, then it's going to be assigned to the person who filled this position in this reports to position field. Once you have all of that set up, you have your employees set up, you have those employees assigned to positions, and you have all of those positions are obviously related to a job. Then you can go in and create your workflow. One thing I'll also point out is in the position hierarchy, if you were to look at this, this is going to give you a graphical overview of the hierarchy that you're currently using that's set up for use with the workflows. And you want to make sure that the hierarchy that you're looking at is this one titled line. This will be the hierarchy name that is used for the workflows. If we were to scroll down into this workflow a little bit, we can see that user I'm using is Julia Thunderbird, who reports to Philip Harris, who reports to Charlie Carson. Okay. Now, if you switch to a different hierarchy, those may be different and will not necessarily apply to the purchase requisition workflow. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to look at, now that we've got the hierarchy set up for our employees, and we're going to look at creating a workflow. This is also done through the procurement and sourcing module. So there's setup section and procurement and sourcing workflows. There's two types of workflows for requisitions. There's purchase requisition line review, which is going to look at each line of the purchase requisition to assign either tasks for that line or submit for approval for each line. You can also submit the purchase requisition as a whole, which is simply the purchase requisition review, which is what we're going to look at today. One of the first things we'll look at is versions in these workflows. So every time you make a change to a particular workflow, it saves those changes. It's going to update the workflow with a new version. Right? So any change, no matter how big or small, it will update that workflow to a new version if you make a change to it. Also, for each type of workflow, you can only have one default type set. One that is set up by default is and go into the procurement and sourcing module. And in our setup section, we have procurement sourcing workflows. Start by creating a new workflow. So here's the two types that we can use for requisitions, the line review or the purchase requisition review, and we'll use the purchase requisition review and create that workflow. So you'll notice there were still two other workflows already created for this particular type. We're going to have to make ours the default type so that we could use it with purchase requisitions. Whichever one is marked as the default type is the one that you will use. All right, so when this opens up, you're now creating your workflow. This is a lot like just creating a Visio flow diagram. It's very simple. The first thing you want to do is for the workflow in general is to go into your basic settings or properties. You'll notice you have basic settings, activation notes, and notifications. You can switch between those without actually closing the properties form. Under basic settings, the first thing it will ask you is to give your workflow a name. We'll just leave this as purchase requisition review. Also, you can specify an owner. It's going to default this to whichever user you're signed in as, but if you want to find a different owner of this workflow, you can specify that here. The submission instructions. So if somebody submits a purchase requisition to this workflow, do you want to include any instructions for submitting to this workflow? You want to specify conditions for using this workflow. So if you only want this workflow used under certain conditions, you can set that up here and specify what those conditions are. We're going to leave this where there's no conditions on running this workflow. The notifications. If you want there to be special notifications sent whenever certain steps are completed in this workflow, you can set those up. So if you want a notification to be sent anytime this workflow is started, you can set that up. Fill in any notification text, and fill in the information for the recipient of that workflow to define who would receive it, who would receive that notification. Then in the notes section, you can add any comments to this particular workflow if you want to update it with 3 comments. Okay, so that's the general setup for the workflow. The next thing we would do is build the elements of this workflow. Here are our workflow elements for reviewing a purchase requisition. First, you have your flow controls. Conditional decisions are decisions that will be made by the system. You can set up certain decisions. If those decisions are true or false, the workflow will then take a different path. A manual decision is a decision that you can assign to someone as a task for them to make a decision one way or another. Parallel activity, if you want the workflow to perform 2 functions at once, you can use a parallel activity, so you have two elements going on at one time. Then if you want to link this workflow to another workflow, you can put in a sub-workflow and specify a separate workflow out of AX that will be run from this workflow. The line item workflows, so our purchase requisition line item workflows, if you remember that was the other type of workflow that we could create. You can add that as part of your purchase requisition workflow and then call one of those other workflows, or those line item workflows from this review workflow. The other 2 that you have are tasks and approved purchase requisitions. Tasks are simply if you need to assign a task to someone during the process of this workflow, you use this task element. you would use to approve the workflow. This step must be in there to ever get this purchase requisition into a status of being approved. We'll keep this pretty basic, and I'm going to add a conditional workflow. And to add an element, you simply drag it into your format on the right side. We're going to say when this is started, first thing it's going to do is make a conditional decision. We'll say if the result of this condition is true, we're going to add the approval step. The result of this condition is true, so we'll go straight to approval. If the result of this condition is false, we're going to assign a pass. At the completion of that task, then we'll move to the approval step. Once the approval has been done, we'll consider this purchase requisition to be ended. All right, so now we have to go through and define all the criteria for each of these elements. First one we're going to look at is the conditional decision. Just simply highlight that condition and go into basic settings. And you're going to name this condition. We'll say, is the requisition complete? We're going to have a conditional decision to determine if all of the necessary information has been entered on this requisition or not. We'll add our first condition. What this is going to do, these conditions are going to allow you to choose from a field either on that requisition or on the workflow and specify what values you're looking for to determine if this condition is true or not. We'll say for this requisition that for it to be true, the currency needs to be equal to US dollars. Then we'll add a second condition. When you add another condition, you can either make it an and condition, an or condition, or you can do kind of a combination of the two, an and either condition where you specify two conditions in either of them to be true. I'm just going to use an and condition. And we'll say that the requisition was created by, we'll just use a specific person in this condition. And like, let me go back into this workflow. For me to recreate my workflow due to the error. Any field on that requisition, you can specify a condition for the workflow to make a decision based on that. Let me just build this really quickly. Our first decision will be a conditional decision. Conditional decision is true. Approval, if the conditional decision is false, we'll assign a task. Once that task is complete, move to the approval step, and then we'll end. So for a conditional decision, we'll just keep it simple. And we're going to name this is the requisition complete. We'll add our first one, which was to verify that the currency is in U.S. dollars. And we'll add a second condition. We'll actually look at the purchase requisition lines. And we're going to choose vendor. So basically what we will be looking for on the purchase requisition line is it will look at every line item on this requisition and determine whether or not there is a vendor specified. We just want to use is not blank. We'll just leave this vendor value blank. So we're going to look for any requisition where the vendor is already entered to specify that condition as being true. Okay, so if the requisition is completed and that vendor and currency information is entered, it will approve. It will go to the approval step. If not, then it will go into this task. For the task, we also have to specify the elements for it, the details for it. We start with this under the basic settings. So we're going to assign a task that says complete the requisition. For a work item subject, and we're going to insert a placeholder, so we're going to actually add a subject to this alert to say what requisition needs to be approved or what requisition needs to be needs to be performed on, and then we'll give any instructions. Let's specify that. You can then choose assignment. So who is this task going to be assigned to? Different assignment types that you'll probably use. Participant, you could assign this to a security-based participant. So any of the security roles that you have set up be a common use for the participant type assignment. And here you can specify any of the security roles. So anybody with that security role would then be allowed to complete this task. Another type, the hierarchy. So if you remember, we set up that hierarchy earlier. To specify this hierarchy type, you'll first want to select where this is going to start from. So when it's selecting who to assign this task to, which person does it start with? And we're going to say the preparer, person who created the requisition. So when we add a condition, we're simply going to say job title. We're going to assign this to anybody the job title of AP clerk, just as an example. Anybody with that job title would be allowed to perform this task on this requisition and be notified of it. The hierarchy options, you could then either assign it to all users retrieved from that collection, or we can just assign it to the last user retrieved, whichever person is last in that list. You can also assign tasks or approvals to a workflow user. The workflow user is always going to be either the workflow originator, the work item owner, or the workflow owner. So if you remember, we could specify an owner for this workflow. That is what it's referring to. We can also assign this to a specific user. If we wanted to specify one particular user, we'll say ourselves, and we can assign a specific user that this task will get assigned to. We can also specify a time limit. So the time limit is going to be how long do they have to complete this step. Okay. If they did not complete it within that time limit, it would then go essentially to this escalation path if we want to use the escalation path. Here we can specify either it gets assigned to someone else by adding an escalation, or we can simply say that the end action, or the end action should be. We'll say if it's not completed in time, it should, the purchase requisition will be rejected. We don't want to create any automatic actions for this. If we wanted to specify a condition where this would automatically get completed or automatically be marked as completed, we can do that. And then for notifications, if you want any notifications sent out when this task is either delegated to someone else, escalated, completed, rejected, or a change is requested, you can set up that notification. Under advanced settings, you can specify what actions are possible to take against this task. We'll just leave it at two possible tasks, just that it can either be completed or the requisition can be rejected. Completed would just mean that somebody actually went in, corrected that vendor and currency, and submitted the workflow, or submitted the requisition to workflow as completed. Okay, so once this requisition has been entered, next step would be to define the approval step. We are under basic settings again. We would now name this approval step. Here we can specify automatic action. So if we want it to be automatically approved, say for example, if it's under a certain dollar amount, we want it to be automatically approved, we can add a condition where the purchase requisition approval amount is, say, less than $1,000 US, then it'll be automatically approved. I can set up that it will be approved. You can also specify any notifications that need to be sent out when this approval step is either delegated, escalated, approved, rejected, or a change is requested from it if you want a notification sent to someone. Then for advanced settings, we can specify a final approver. So once this approval step is completed, once somebody actually approves this purchase requisition, if you want it to always then be sent to a final approver, specify, you can check that and specify who that final approver should be. Also, if you want to specify a time limit for this step to be completed, do that here. Then you can specify any actions that you want an approver to be able to take against the purchase requisition. Okay, so once you have those basic settings on your approval step, you then have to use this level down function to define that approval. So we're actually going to apply two steps to this. So we have a new workflow element for this approval step. We're going to add two steps to this. The first step, we'll say if the purchase requisition is between, say, $1,000 and $2,000, it goes to one approver. Step two would be if it's over $2,000, it goes to someone else. Step one, we open our basic settings. Say, give name. Give us a subject. We would have to assign this step to someone. What we're going to use here is the hierarchy feature. We're going to say, start from the preparer. So it's going to begin with prepare just a requisition. Then we're going to add a condition. So the condition is on the employee that we're looking for. So in the hierarchy structure, you have the different options for looking for a specific employee for this approval to be assigned to. One that's most commonly used, or would be very commonly used, is this employee.line manager level. What this means is that you can specify a value. If I put 1 in here, then whoever this preparer is, it will then assign this to the person that is 1 position ahead of above them. Right? So whoever the preparer reports to in their position would be assigned to the 1. Specify a 2 here, then whoever the preparer reports to would not be assigned this requisition. The person above them would. So it would go up 2 levels to higher. Okay. We specified this as 1. If you remember, we are Julia Thunderbird. This would be assigned to Phyllis, who was our direct, who was the person who direct employee. Just for options, we're going to say only assigned to the last user retrieved, or we can use all users since this is just going up 1 level. If you were going up 2 levels, you may want to only assign to the last user retrieved. If you assign it to all users retrieved, it would assign it to both the person directly above you and the person directly above them. If you assign it only to the last user, it would just assign it to the person 2 levels above. Then we want to specify the conditions in this step is run. Right? We can either say always run this step, or we can only run it when a certain condition is met. We only want to run this particular step. The purchase requisition amount is less than $2,000. And purchase for the approval amount, which is the value on the purchase requisition, greater than $1,000. Right? So this is the condition for running this particular step. Escalation, if the person who this is assigned to does not complete it in the amount of time, do we want to escalate this to another person or not? Right? We could use the escalation path to escalate it to another person or take automatic action. For the second step in this process, you will then need to define that. We'll say approval for over 2,000. Subject and instruction. To specify who this is assigned to. Again, we can use the managerial hierarchy, say that we're going to look for an employee at the managed level. We're going to look for the person who is or the person we directly report to, but the person they directly report to. For our hierarchy options, so we don't get both users retrieved, or if we don't give this approval assigned to both of those users, we just assign it to the last user retrieved. So for the condition, we're only going to run this step, the approval amount greater than $2,000. Once we complete that step, this workflow is completed. If you're running this workflow and you get errors, there's a method to review any errors. But obviously, you want to make sure that this is set up as accurately as possible the first time. When you click close and save, it's going to ask you to enter a comment for a particular version. We're creating a new version, and then it's going to ask you if you want to activate this version or if you want to keep the previous version active and not yet active this one. Go ahead and activate this version. Now we have this new purchase requisition workflow. It is about the default type, so we'll want to set it as default. We'll uncheck any other ones that are of the same type. We're setting this workflow as our default type. We can also look at the version. So right now we only have one version. If there was more listed here, we could go back to the previous version, make it active, or we could edit any of those previous versions and work from there. Okay. So once your workflow is created, once all of that information is completed, and then go back to your purchase requisition, you can then submit it to a workflow. Once it's submitted to the workflow, it will go through this process of finding those tasks. Once all of those tasks are completed and approved, the workflow is complete and that job, that requisition is approved. You'll get the green check mark here, which means you can then go into Release Approved Purchase Requisition and create a purchase order for that particular requisition. Just to review, the workflow setup, it was very similar to Visio like we saw. First thing you'll need to do is set up the general workflow parameters and then go through and specify any of those elements that you want to add to your workflow. Right? This is an example of a workflow that you could set up. It's very similar to the one we did set up. You would first have the requester or the person who submitted the workflow. Any information was missing, which was our conditional decision. It got sent to another person to review that. We find a task for them to complete that information. Once everything was completed, we had the approval step left, which we would automatically approve if the amount was under a certain value. And if it was over that value, we set the conditions on who would actually approve that workflow. And then once it was approved, the requisition would be in approved status, completed, and to be turned in to a purchase order. So that completes our session for today on purchase requisitions. If you have any additional questions after today, you can email us at info@ivasteam.com. Thank you very much for your time and have a good day.